Today I'm presenting on behalf of a few different co-authors, Christian Parra, Deanna Kemp and John Owen. And while they've deeply influenced my thinking on what I'll talk about today, all of the mistakes are my own, I will confess. So what I wanted to do was today reflect on the practice of development in mining. And I wanted to do that thinking about two recent projects that I've been involved with. So the first is some work that we did on behalf of the International Council for Mining Metals and Claire White's group here. And we're trying to understand the approaches to understanding development outcomes from mining. The second piece of work that I'm reflecting on for today's presentation is a special issue of a journal called Resources Policy. And the special issue is one that I co-edited with colleagues David Burton and Chris Moran on cumulative impacts in resource regions. We've been doing some work in cumulative impacts for some time. Obviously the most common circumstance in which cumulative impacts arise around mining is related to multiple mining projects, but not always. So we've been thinking about what are the challenges of thinking about resource regions as opposed to mining projects and the communities around them. And there's been a lot of talk lately about mining as a development industry or a social development agent. It's quite an advance in terminology that's come about from some very senior corporate leaders. So Mark Cutifani is the new CEO of Anglo American, also the head of the ICMM. And the discussion of mining as a development industry, I think we would need to ask ourselves, well, what would it take for mining to be a development industry? If that's where we want to take the debate, to say that mining is more than just has a development impact, I think we need to question around what would it take to get there. And the reason why I say that is because mining's got a history of enclave development. We can't just go on as practice as usual if we want to meet this goal of mining being a development agent. And part of that's the challenge of what mining is. It's a large technological project. It's connected to international capital markets, and it's in the periphery of the global economy. So there's lots of social challenges associated with that, lots of technical, lots of economic challenges. But the history is that mining has been largely an enclave-style development. So what would it take for us to think of mining as a development agent, development actor, with this history? And there's also a social context to that and an economic context where we've seen over the last 10 years huge increases in the value of our mineral resources. Right? So with that, over time, I think we've seen greater expectations. Expectations from local community, but also expectations from governments that this wave of new investment in mining in their country is going to lead to development outcomes that they aspire to. Right? And one of the challenges is that communities see the large profits that are being experienced by companies in the top of the cycle. So the most profitable company in the developing world in 2010 was Anglo American, and it far outstripped all of the other companies. They don't see the other side of the equation when the commodity market is down and the profits that are experienced now have to be balanced over time. But nonetheless, these are relatively profitable entities in circumstances where you've got huge development challenges and development needs. So there's four kind of areas of focus that I think about when we're trying to talk about the contributions of mining to development. And the first is the development associated with the core business activity. And there's been lots of work of late to try and ground that activity in its context, to make it so that the employment, the business development, the procurement that's associated with mining is actually leading to local development and regional development in those locations. Because that's a huge opportunity to maximise development from things that are core to the business objectives of companies. So we've seen Indigenous employment become more of an issue in the mining industry. We've seen local level procurement become important, and guides and practices and case studies shared of how we can do that better. I think we're starting to see a dialogue around dual purpose focus of development. What I mean by that is that there are activities that are associated with mining that offer both private and public purpose. An example might be a rail line. Right? And there's ways in which you could leverage that infrastructure to really provide development outcomes for local communities. So we're seeing some work by, for example, the Vale Columbia Centre in the States. They're looking at development corridors in Mozambique. And our centre is also doing some work in Indonesia around this. So what would it mean for a rail project to actually provide opportunities for local agricultural development and provide opportunities for mineral development? So these are bigger questions around dual purpose infrastructure. The third area is direct social investment. This is the one I think people jump to very quickly when we think about development outcomes from mining. We think that the role of mining industry is to provide social and environmental programs that would provide development. And I think we jump to that question because that's what development agencies do. That's the traditional way in which the development sector has worked, to put in place programs of development. There are lots of challenges around this, and in the second part of my talk I'm going to talk probably more about this. And I'll probably wait till I get to that point. The fourth area is macroeconomic development. And part of this is something that companies have no influence over. Right? There's taxation and royalties that are controlled by government, and government uses it as it sees fit because they're the sovereign owners of that wealth. There is a question around the extent to which companies are avoiding taxation through transfer pricing and those kind of things, so that influences development, of course. But in general, that's a domain that government is in control of. Of course, mining may not contribute to development at all. I mean, there are circumstances where mining creates negative impact which would have detrimental effects on development, for example, impacting other sectors or leading to social change that inhibits people's lives. So we shouldn't forget about that in talking about the development debate. Returning to this issue of social investment, when you look at the mining industry, it is a rather large player in providing investment. So what we have here is 7 companies selected that Christian Parra developed this graph. 7 companies, and we've looked at, in what was the annual worldwide direct community investment for those companies. And they're ordered from BHP Billiton, Rio Tinto, Vale, Xstrata. That's ordered by annual revenue. And you'll see that we're starting to talk about $1 billion a year in direct social investment from just 7 companies. That's a very large amount of money. And it begs the question, is this amount of money being used to its best application? And another way to think about it might be to say, well, if we were to look at official development assistance by country, and we were to throw those 7 mining companies that we've just selected and looked at into the mix, that'd form number 19 in the world in terms of the magnitude of development, right? Just through direct social investment through programs. And most of the time in which development's being undertaken in the mining sector, it's been done as a means to develop a relationship with communities, but oftentimes a means to try and resolve conflict or to try and prevent conflict. But what we've seen is it's actually not very effective at doing that. Right? CSR programs are remarkably ineffective at generating legitimacy in the eyes of local community because of the way in which we're doing development in the mining sector. And it's led Bruce Harvey, who works with Rio Tinto, to say that social development will not deliver social license. I have some sympathy for that viewpoint, right? Development does not equal social license. But the opposite is also true. The absence of development will most definitely lead to social license. So mining can't operate in a context where it is enclave development, right? Communities and governments are expecting there to be a development outcome, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll lead to social license. So the two things I wanted to reflect on today, and kind of the crux of my presentation, was how might we better align community development in the mining industry. And I think there's two axes in which we might do that. One is the focus of development, and one is the agents of development. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. So the first is the focus of development, and this is something that I do see a bit of activity around. There's a lot of practitioners thinking about this. And that is, how do we align business objectives and link them to development priorities? And we can use a whole host of different processes to understand what development priorities are. We might undertake community planning, we might have an agreement-making process, we might try and link impact assessment with development in the region, so trying to understand through technical and participatory means what are the issues in that location, and how might we best use this development opportunity to deliver on those priorities. What we don't tend to see, though, is real deep reflection within the business around what its objectives are. And too often, the experience of CSR and development in the mining sector is about public relations. And I'll show you an example that I actually presented here at last conference of a company I worked with, where we looked at direct community investment as a function of business risk. They have a large development program, a very large program, and when we looked at the program and we defined the areas of business risk, we saw that actually the majority of what they were doing, 70% of all of their spending, was related to things that were of no risk to the business at all. Right? Sport, arts, culture, community health. And don't get me wrong, these are important things for society, but are they the things that that company should best invest in at that time? Are they actually even the things that community would want to invest in? Or that if you took a lens of, we want to improve this region and with an outlook to 20 years' time, would these be the things that you'd invest in? The medium risk area, the area that I think should be much bigger, was around enterprise development, education, social development. The high risk activities, the things like environment and Indigenous peoples, the things that you could have really good innovative programs around, for example, participatory water monitoring or inclusive development with Indigenous peoples, they're only a very small proportion of the development activities of that company. So even from a perspective of the business, the money is not being well spent in the examples that I've looked at. So what about the agents of development? Right? You've got lots of different actors out there participating in development focused activities. Some of them are mining companies, some of them are development actors in the traditional sense, like aid organisations. Some of them are governments, some of them are civil society, some of them are even community organisations themselves. And each of them is going about their activities, perhaps doing some engagement and needs assessment, and then delivering and supporting development separately. And there's an enormous lack of coordination in the development activities, and there's therefore a lost opportunity in terms of leveraging. Now, what most people have come to the conclusion of, well, we need to collaborate more. Maybe we can pool our activities, we can prioritise, we can come together and undertake a needs assessment collectively and deliver collectively. Right? And sometimes this works, but it's very difficult. And we've even seen governments now start mandating social investment. So this is work from Karen McNabb and David Burton and Ramani from BG. And they're looking at government-mandated social investment across the world in a report called Beyond Voluntarism. And you'll see in many locations what government is trying to do is get those actors to work together a bit more. In Australia, they had a process whereby in Gladstone, the government did a social infrastructure study and then set up a foundation and asked multiple companies to contribute to that foundation to then deliver activities. Right? But it didn't really work because the barriers to collaboration of coming together are quite difficult. So when we think about barriers to collaboration, there's all of the traditional ones: time, trust, territory, resources, but institutional culture is a big one. And competition between companies in a competitive context of developing new projects is sometimes very acute. We don't necessarily need to collaborate, we just need to coordinate. We can exchange information and alter activities of our own organisations for the common purpose. And while we might, we can undertake activities collectively to understand context and work out what development priorities are, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to deliver those things collectively. So with greater coordination, I think we'd be able to provide better alignment of the agents of development, as well as of grounding development, the focus of development. So I'll leave it there. I've got just a couple of minutes for questions, but thanks for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.